You know someone you've never met. That someone appears on your screen every week, maybe every morning. You know their dog's name. You know their coffee order, their last breakup, their childhood anxiety. You've spent more time listening to their voice than you've spent in conversation with most people in your life. And if they disappeared tomorrow, no explanation, just gone, you would feel something real. That's not a character flaw. That's not pathology. And it's certainly not new. This kind of one-sided bond has been documented in human psychology since at least 1956. What's new is the architecture. The system that now delivers this experience to you was built with a specific understanding of human social needs and optimized not to meet those needs, but to monetize them. This video is about that system, about the psychology of parasocial relationships, the technical mechanisms that amplify them, and what research shows about what happens to your capacity for real connection when a simulated version is available on demand. There's a documented loneliness epidemic in the United States. In 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General issued a formal advisory declaring social isolation a public health crisis, associating chronic loneliness with the same risk of premature death as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Not associated with lower quality of life, associated with measurable early death. At the same time, Americans are more technically connected than at any previous point in history. More followers, more creators, more parasocial relationships than any prior generation could have maintained. These two facts coexist. That coexistence deserves an explanation. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Americans now spend an average of 4 hours per week socializing in person with friends, down from over 6.5 hours 2 decades ago. For teenagers, the collapse is more pronounced. Adolescents spend roughly 40 minutes per day with friends in person outside school, compared to around 140 minutes in the early 2000s. And in a 2021 national survey, 12% of American adults reported having no close friends at all. In the 1990s, that number was approximately 3%. Here's a way to feel the scale of that. Consider a dedicated viewer of a mid-sized creator, 500,000 followers, 5 videos per week, 20 minutes each. In 3 years, that viewer has invested over 260 hours with that person. Researchers studying friendship formation estimate that moving from acquaintance to close friendship typically requires more than 200 hours of shared time. That viewer has spent more time with this creator than with most of their real friends. The creator doesn't know their name. That asymmetry is the thing worth understanding. How does it develop? What does it do, and who benefits from it? To understand what parasocial relationships actually are, we start with 1956. Donald Horton and Richard Wohl published a paper that remains foundational. They were studying television and noticed something both obvious and strange. Audiences formed what felt like genuine relationships with performers they had never met and would never meet. They called it intimacy at a distance. The performer speaks to the camera, which means they speak to you specifically. They use your language. You know what I mean. We've talked about this before. Let me tell you something. They share personal details, their insecurities, their routines, their relationships. They appear regularly, creating what Horton and Wohl described as a relationship that becomes counted on, planned for, and integrated into daily routines. Your brain processes this as socially meaningful. Your cognitive systems activate the same neural representations they use for actual social relationships. You develop familiarity. You develop concern. You develop something that functions like affection. And when the performer goes silent for 2 weeks, you feel something like worry. This is not a malfunction. The human brain evolved to form bonds with people who communicate repeatedly, who share personal information, who demonstrate interest in your well-being. The brain was not designed to distinguish whether that communication is mutual or simulated. What Horton and Wohl could not have predicted is that 70 years later, the economics of media would be rebuilt on engineering this experience deliberately, at industrial scale, delivered not at broadcast times, but on demand. In 1956, parasocial relationships formed with people who appeared on television a few hours per week. Contact was bounded by broadcast schedules. What algorithmic systems changed is not the psychology, it's the delivery infrastructure. Your behavior on a platform generates signals, not just what you click, how long you watch, where you pause, whether you rewind, whether you return to the same creator the next day. These signals get processed into patterns. Patterns identify which creators generate high engagement from users similar to you. The algorithm delivers more of those creators to you. Researchers studying creator strategies find that certain behaviors generate disproportionately higher engagement. Behaviors that include speaking directly to the viewer, sharing personal vulnerability, creating continuity through recurring references to their own life, and simulating intimacy through confessional tone. Creators who adopt these behaviors receive more algorithmic distribution. More distribution means more viewers. More viewers means more revenue. The economic incentive is transparent and structural. This is not a conspiracy. No one at any platform designed a program to weaponize loneliness. What happened instead is simpler and harder to fix. A system optimized for engagement selected the creators and behaviors best at producing parasocial bonds, because parasocial bonds generate the engagement signals the system rewards. The result is an industry, not an accident. Parasocial relationships function as an analgesic for loneliness, not metaphorically, a literal one, documented through experimental research. In a controlled experiment, participants were randomly assigned to either engage with content from their favorite creator or interact with someone they knew. Both groups reported feeling less lonely immediately afterward. The parasocial condition worked. The pain relief was real. The difference appeared when researchers measured deeper outcomes: sustained well-being, sense of belonging, feeling genuinely understood. Real interaction produced those outcomes more robustly. Parasocial interaction produced immediate alleviation, but not the deeper experience. The best analogy is nutritional. A parasocial relationship is to real connection what refined sugar is to a meal. The feeling of having had something is real. The feeling that hunger has passed is real. What's absent is the nutritive content, the reciprocity, the genuine otherness, the friction of being truly known by someone who could also need things from you. Here's the cycle. You experience loneliness. A creator you follow appears, reliably, warmly, attuned to exactly your emotional register. The loneliness reduces. You return. The algorithm notes your pattern and ensures the creator keeps appearing. The loneliness keeps being managed at the surface. The motivation to invest in something that could address it more deeply, which requires more effort, more risk, more reciprocal exposure, diminishes slightly. Not dramatically, a few degrees, maintained over years. That is the mechanism. Not conspiracy, not stupidity. Behavioral incentives, technological infrastructure, and human psychology producing a predictable output. All sources cited in this video are listed in the description with full references, authors, publication, year, and links where available. You can verify every claim independently. That's not a disclaimer, that's the standard.
This was not a single survey. It was 3 independent studies conducted with the same general design, totaling 3,085 participants across multiple waves. Running the same finding 3 times with different samples is how researchers test whether a result is real or a statistical fluke. All 3 replications found the same pattern. Participants rated their strongest parasocial relationship as emotionally closer than most of their real-life acquaintances, though still less effectively than close two-sided relationships. The most important word is perceived. This study measures what participants believe about their relationships, not what those relationships actually deliver over time. The perception of closeness and actual psychological sustenance are not the same thing. What the study establishes is crucial. Parasocial bonds don't exist as a separate category, they compete on the same psychological real estate. When someone is choosing whether to reach out to an acquaintance or watch a creator they feel close to, those are not obviously different categories of social activity. The experimental design here matters. Random assignment separates this from a study where lonely people seek out parasocial content and happen to feel better afterward. The finding? Both parasocial engagement and real interaction reduced reported loneliness short-term. Neither produced the long-term belonging that sustained real connection generates. What's important is the timing implication. If parasocial engagement reliably reduces acute loneliness, then every time loneliness would motivate seeking real connection, there's a lower-cost, immediately available alternative. That alternative doesn't need to destroy your social life to affect it. It just needs to take the edge off repeatedly over years. The friendship recession data I mentioned deserves methodological context. The American Time Use Survey is conducted annually by the Bureau of Labor Statistics with representative national samples. The decline in in-person socializing is robust, not an artifact. The Survey Center on American Life's finding, 12% of adults with no close friends in 2021 versus 3% in the 1990s, is from a nationally representative survey with public methodology. These findings document that something real has changed. They do not tell us why. The candidate explanations include increased work hours and remote work that reduce social contact, declining membership in civic and religious institutions that historically created friendship infrastructure, rising housing costs that reduce geographic stability, and increased time in algorithmic media environments that may substitute for social engagement. All of these likely contribute. Attributing the friendship recession to any single cause, including parasocial relationships, would exceed what the data supports. The narrative so far, loneliness rises, parasocial relationships fill the gap, has appealing internal logic, but significant research complicates it. First, causality and direction of effect. Recent meta-analyses looking at the relationship between social media use and loneliness found both relationships exist, and both are weak. Standardized effect sizes in both directions were approximately 0.10. That's real, but small. It means knowing someone's social media use tells you very little about how lonely they'll be, and knowing their loneliness tells you very little about their media use. This matters because earlier, smaller studies often reported much larger correlations, numbers that circulated widely in popular discourse. The meta-analysis suggests those earlier numbers were likely inflated by publication bias. Second, structural perspective. Research argues that workplace isolation, collapse of civic institutions, housing precarity, and economic insecurity explain more variance in loneliness than digital behavior does. The conclusion is not that social media has no effect, it's that you could eliminate social media entirely and still face a loneliness crisis because underlying conditions operate independently of digital behavior. This is a corrective against an incomplete story. It doesn't eliminate the mechanism I described, it contextualizes it. Third, who benefits? For some populations, parasocial relationships are not a substitute for real connection they can't access. They're the only form of certain kinds of connection available to them at all. Research on LGBTQ+ youth in unsupportive environments consistently documents this. YouTube parasocial relationships were positively associated with social connectedness and psychological well-being, functioning as genuine community infrastructure for people with limited in-person access to similar others. For transgender and non-binary young people specifically, stronger parasocial relationships with queer creators correlated with higher transgender pride and community connectedness, particularly when family support was absent. For adolescents in rural areas or in families unsupportive of their identities, parasocial relationships with creators outside their immediate context provided genuine developmental resources, vocabulary for identity, models of adult flourishing, community before local community was available. The algorithm doesn't distinguish between someone slowly outsourcing social needs and someone for whom parasocial relationships are genuinely the safest available exploration. It delivers the same product. The effects are not the same. Any honest analysis has to hold this. The system creates real harm for some and real benefit for others, distributed along lines the system itself cannot see. The research covers short and medium term. It does not cover what people actually want to know. What does a life shaped by heavy parasocial engagement look like at 35 or 50? We don't know. The generation experiencing this at scale is too young to have reached that point. We won't have clean data until the mid-2030s at earliest. We also don't know what AI parasocial figures, interactive systems that simulate intimate, responsive relationships, will produce. Research on human-to-human parasocial bonds is growing. Research on AI-to-human parasocial bonds is in its earliest stages. Their deployment is already underway. Parasocial bonds are neurologically real and psychologically meaningful. They reliably reduce acute loneliness. They do not reliably produce the deeper belonging that genuine relationships generate. Algorithmic systems are structured to amplify these bonds, regardless of whether the viewer has alternative social resources or depends on them as primary substitute. The loneliness crisis is real and measurable. Social media and parasocial relationships are one contributing factor among several structural ones. Attributing the crisis primarily to this cause exceeds what data supports. Long-term effects of primarily parasocial social engagement are unknown. That uncertainty is real, not rhetorical. We've covered the psychology, the mechanism, the evidence, and where it honestly stops. Population-level data can only tell you that a pattern exists. It can't tell you where you sit in that pattern, whether parasocial relationships in your life are supplementing real connection or substituting for it. Whether they're filling space that couldn't hold something else or occupying space that could. That's a question only you have access to. If you've recognized the mechanism in something specific, I'd genuinely like to hear how you make sense of it. Not because I have an answer, because what you observe adds nuance that aggregate data can't capture. The comments are open. And if this kind of analysis,
Rigorous, willing to sit with what we don't know, unwilling to sell you something, has value. The next video picks up a thread from this one. We've been talking about simulated connection as analgesic for loneliness. Next, explores the longer historical arc, what Aldous Huxley predicted in 1932 about a society that anesthetizes citizens with pleasure, and how precisely that maps onto the present. If that's the kind of analysis you want more of, subscribe. No algorithm required to find the next one. Before we close, here's what all of this adds up to. We started with a simple observation. You know someone you've never met. Now you have the mechanism. In 1956, Horton Wohl described how parasocial figures become integrated into daily life, counted on, planned for, woven into the texture of a week. They were describing television presenters who appeared a few hours a week. They didn't know that 70 years later, the economics of media would be reconstructed around that exact psychological function. That entire infrastructure of algorithmic delivery, creator incentives, and engagement optimization would be built to ensure you have access on demand, whenever loneliness is acute enough to need it. And that it would work. The parasocial relationship genuinely reduces pain. The algorithm genuinely delivers someone who seems to understand you. The connection you feel is neurologically real. The question isn't whether it's real. The question is what it costs. What research suggests is that the cost may be paid in motivation. If parasocial engagement reliably takes the edge off acute loneliness, then every time that would otherwise motivate real connection, there's a lower cost alternative present. The threshold for deeper investment rises slightly, not catastrophically, not dramatically, just enough to make the calculus shift incrementally over years. You're not broken for being in that calculus. You're in a system designed to put you there. The behavioral scientists studying engagement, the creators who discovered what keeps audiences returning, the platforms rewarding them, none targeted you specifically. You were targeted by system logic, which doesn't need to name you to find you. The U.S. Surgeon General named this as public health crisis in 2023. That framing matters, not because it makes the problem more dramatic, but because it locates the solution at the right level. Individual decisions about who you follow don't solve a public health crisis. They may be worth making, but they don't solve it. What would solve it requires harder questions about structural conditions, economic pressures that reduce time and energy for social investment, collapse of civic institutions that once created friendship infrastructure, and business models that benefit from treating loneliness as inventory to be managed rather than problem to be resolved. The question worth sitting with is this: what is the difference between connection and the simulation of connection, and how long can you tell them apart?